Well, welcome back to something rather unique, my friends. In this edition of GB 102, Bible Backgrounds, we will discuss one of the more ancient questions of world history, namely, how did the Egyptian pyramids come to be? Who built these large monuments, and why? And in particular, we're going to discuss the issues of ancient epistemology and try to tackle the question of how do we know what we know about the ancient world? And so, with all of that up front, let's go exploring this most ancient of the seven wonders of the world, the pyramids of Egypt. So, let's begin with the obvious. The pyramids of Egypt are cool. I mean, they've been impressing tourists and visitors to Egypt for thousands of years. And a simple list of their vital statistics is enough to prove why they're impressive even today. For example, the largest of the pyramids, the Pyramid of Khufu, has a base of about 13.1 acres of land area. That's humongous. And it measures 481 feet tall. The four corners of the pyramid each face a different cardinal direction, north, east, south, and west, respectively. Additionally, the sides of the pyramid slope at a fairly steep 51.84 degrees, meaning that it's not exactly an equilateral shape. That would require it to have a slope of exactly 60 degrees, but it's still a pretty impressive feat of architecture and arithmetic, considering we are talking about an early Bronze Age people group. This, of course, has raised all sorts of questions. How did they manage to move all that stone building material? Especially since most of the limestone blocks that are used in its construction weigh at least as much as an automobile. And how many people did it take to make the pyramid? How long did it take to make one? Well, needless to say, all of these questions has encouraged all sorts of speculation. And from ancient to modern, we've had many different theories and opinions about these buildings. Now, I'm sure you all are familiar with the three large pyramids of the town of Giza, and these are certainly the most visited landmarks in all of Egypt. And because of this high amount of tourist traffic and the thousands of photos taken of these specific three pyramids every year, it is a somewhat common misconception that there's really only three pyramids in Egypt. Well, this is false, as Egypt boasts nearly 200 or 120 pyramids of various sizes, designs, and states of preservation. And it's also clear that the Great Pyramids of Giza were some of the last ones constructed during the Old Kingdom dynasties. Now, Egyptian records of the Third Dynasty note that numerous pharaohs tried to construct a tomb that was flat-roofed, known as a mastaba. And eventually, a pharaoh by the name of Djoser got the bright idea that he would simply stack smaller mastabas on top of his already finished mastaba. And the end result of this process, once you've repeated it 5 times over, is the creation of what we would call a step pyramid. And this indicates that the Egyptians didn't receive a grand spark of inspiration one day and then they suddenly knew how to build a flat-sloped pyramid the next. The western landscape of Egypt is literally littered with dozens of pyramids, and they were all constructed between 2800 BC and 2600 BC. And some of these could not hold up under their own weight, such as the pyramid of Amenhotep I, and it fell over, standing only a few centuries. Others have remained erect until this present day, and all of this data points to the notion that the Egyptians learned how to build pyramids through trial and error. And it also indicates that when a new pharaoh assumed power, they saw it as their duty to try to build one of these things. And this would have given the Egyptians ample practice in refining their designs. They would learn how to quarry rock better. They would learn how to use levers and ramps to move their material. In short, by the time we get to the time of Khufu, near around 2600 BC, they've been attempting to build massive pyramids for years, up to 2 centuries. And when you've had 200 years and more to try to build these things, you start to get good at it. So just think about that for a moment. They have been building pyramids for longer than the United States has been a country. That's a very long time to get your methods and your tools and your plans worked out down to a science. Now, according to the Egyptian records, the first pyramid designer who successfully figured out how to create that step-style pyramid is a royal vizier by the name of Imhotep. He was a priest of the sun, and he's living around 2670 BC. And Imhotep is commissioned by a pharaoh named Djoser to turn his mastaba into a single geometric structure. Now, when Imhotep succeeded in fulfilling his master's wishes, Djoser the pharaoh declared that Imhotep had become a god. Now, personally, I find this statement to be very interesting. Other Egyptian legends had absolutely no problem attributing things to a supernatural origin if they couldn't explain how it happened. But the fact that Imhotep is promoted to the rank of deity suggests that everyone knew he was just an ordinary man. He was an ordinary man who managed to accomplish something extraordinary, but ordinary all the same. And this is why many of the theories of a supernatural or even extraterrestrial origin of the pyramids just do not mesh well with the early Egyptian accounts that they provided. Had the Egyptians believed that Imhotep was a god or an angelic being or something other than a human, they would have probably been very happy to report such a thing. However, the Egyptian records are rather mundane in this regard. They simply say Imhotep was a priest, he came up with a bright idea, and his pharaoh honored him like a god for his stroke of brilliance. Now, on top of all that, with regards to the development of technology associated with pyramid building, we should also note that the construction of a smooth-sided pyramid was also a matter of trial and error. For example, the pyramid of Snefru, built after Imhotep but before Khufu and his Great Pyramid, is known as the Bent Pyramid, and the picture on the slide here makes it fairly obvious why. The pyramid itself began at an angle of about 54 degrees, a little bit more steep than the Great Pyramid at Giza, and about halfway through its construction it was redesigned to a much more shallow angle of 43 degrees, and this was done to accommodate the weight of the pyramid. And once again, all of this suggests that building pyramids was not a supernatural or hyper-intelligent idea, but really just human beings trying out a new design. Did it work? Okay, not quite. Let's fix it there, and we'll try a different design later. And this seems to be what's happening. They're trying to find the correct angle where they can use the limestone blocks to build successfully and hold up its own weight. And this magic number seems to be somewhere around 50 and 52 degrees. And so with all this in mind, let me give you my first conclusion about the pyramids, and that is this. They appear to be a man-made idea with a man-made origin because we see clear lines of development from very simple to complex. If you will, maybe this analogy may help. If modern rocket technology suddenly just popped into existence today, and for example, let's pretend mankind didn't know how to fly, and then all of a sudden overnight we've got a space shuttle, we can go into outer space. I might feel inclined to say that that kind of technology could only happen through magic, aliens, angels, or some other more evolved form of life. But this doesn't mesh with the historical record itself. We know that rocket technology has been developing for centuries. Starting in the Ming Dynasty in China, we see the progression of guided rockets all the way through the World War II era, and eventually we start seeing numerous designs of rockets designed to go into outer space. We tested the technology, we refined the technology, and once we get to where we are today with things like the space shuttle, we know there's nothing magical about this process. It is simply trial and error, refining designs, shifting the technology, tweaking the technology until we arrived at something we know that works well. And I would suggest the same is true for pyramid technology in the Egyptians. You see, the pyramids of Giza, even though they're very impressive, they simply show that they have a development of design from simple to more complex. They don't employ unique technology. They don't employ different building materials. They use the same types of limestone blocks throughout because that's simply the bedrock they have to work with. Simply put, the difference between the Great Pyramids of Egypt and the early step pyramids of Djoser are really not all that different. And so let's move on to the next question that people often ask concerning the pyramids, and that is, how was a pyramid built? Well, this is one of those more complex questions because we don't have a definitive source. That there is no ancient Egyptian source that basically lays out step 1, do this, step 2, do this, and tell you step by step how they made their pyramids. And because there isn't this part of the historical record available to us, this has led to all sorts of speculation, both scholarly and popular for that matter, on how such architectural feats were accomplished. So it's at this point that I'd like to simply point out a simple fact about pyramid design, and that is, it's a relatively simple design. If you ask any 4-year-old, here, stack these blocks, they're going to probably go with a very tried and true method that you put more blocks on the bottom, and these are used to hold up fewer blocks on top. And this is the basic premise of the pyramids. More material is on the bottom to support less material on top. So in terms of architecture, this is nowhere near as advanced as, say, a Roman arch, where you have a thin set of pillars that support a mass of stone in the air that has air underneath it, with no undergirding support. So in short, the building accomplishments of the Egyptian pyramids is their height. It's not the architectural design. So, in case you're not quite convinced, try this little experiment at home sometime, and you can show yourself just how simple it is to design a pyramid. Grab about 100 small blocks, baby blocks, dice, whatever you've got handy, and stack them so they form a base that is 7 by 7 square. Next, stack another square 6 by 6 on top of that, making your 2-dimensional model turn into a 3-dimensional model. Now keep stacking 5 by 5, 4 by 4, 3 by 3, 2 by 2, and then finally 1 on the very top. And stand back and congratulate yourself. You've just made a pyramid, and all it took was having properly measured blocks and a little bit of foresight to stack them strategically. Now, this is exactly the plan of action we see in the pyramids. We have massive blocks. They're huge, but they're stacked in smaller and smaller concentric squares, and then eventually they are piled up to make the pyramid shape. And it naturally forms so long as you are consistent in how far you move in closer to the center with each concentric square. And so this doesn't really require what we would call advanced math. It just requires consistency to stack the blocks a little bit further in each level up you go. And this consistency could have been very easily achieved with a simple measuring stick. And so at this point, I'm going to guess what you're thinking here. You're probably saying something like, but Professor Allen, you said previously that all of these pyramids are measured perfectly along the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, west, and surely this must have taken some form of advanced math, right? Well, actually, no. This is one of those instances where a good night out stargazing would teach people just how simple it is to find north. Every night, when the stars appear, they appear to rotate across the sky, making a circular path. Time-lapse photography captures this phenomenon all the time. You will notice, though, that the closer you get to north, the smaller and smaller the circular paths become, and we see this demonstrated on the photo here in this slide. Now, the North Star is at the center of this apparent pattern of rotation, and it stays there consistently. People have been using the North Star for millennia to ascertain which direction north is. Well, once you know which way north is, well, finding the other 3 cardinal points is simply a matter of turning 90 degrees. And so, it's almost impossible to screw this process up once you're using square blocks. Once you've placed the first block correctly, so that one of its sides is facing north. The other four sides are naturally facing west, south, east, etc. And when you place blocks onto that, they will continue to follow that pattern. So, to be honest, the entire idea of orienting your pyramid can be done in the course of a night and simply laying your first block correctly. Now, once we get to this point, the next objection that usually comes up is, well, okay, so it didn't take advanced math to lay the block, but it certainly took some kind of advanced or alien technology to move those stone blocks all the way from the quarry, sometimes several hundred miles away, into the land of Egypt, up to Giza, and then finally to put it in the pyramid. Well, unfortunately here we have plenty of Egyptian pictographic evidence. The Egyptians liked drawing life on the Nile River, and one of the more prominent motifs of the Old Kingdom is showing very large boats going up and down the river, and they are carrying with them large stone blocks. And so with this regard, once you place a block on a floating island, as it were, or a ship, you can basically take a lot of the problem of friction out of the transportation issues. And so the majority of the trip for these blocks is happening on the Nile River or on smaller wadis as you get closer to the city of Giza. And what this means is, quite frankly, you are allowing the water to move the block for you. And since all of the quarries that these stones come from are upstream, the river will naturally take you down there with the least amount of energy expended as possible. Now, the second objection usually goes like this. Okay, so it's fine that they use the water to move it, but once you get it on land, isn't it nearly impossible to move a 15, 20-ton piece of rock? Well, the simple answer to that is, actually, it's quite easy to move a stone that big, so long as you use what's called a mechanical advantage. Now, the simplest of mechanical advantages is to use what we would call a wheel or a cylinder. And, interestingly enough, the easiest way to put wheels under a rock like this is to take very large trunks of wood and shave them down till they are cylindrical, and keep moving them in front of your piece of rock as you pull it. And we've been seeing people do this for centuries. For example, in the slide here, we have a picture of a group of natives of the island of Java, and they are moving a 26-ton stone block. And, we also have approximately a 150-pound man who is acting as foreman standing on top of this block. And notice what's under it. Small logs that are roughly cylindrical that are being used to help move this stone. And notice it does take quite a number of people, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30. But notice that, even if we're talking about 40 people to push a block, that's not a lot of people when you consider that the archaeological evidence outside of Giza says that the workforce used for working on the pyramids equaled roughly 10 to 15,000. Using 20 to 40 men per block, you could move quite a lot of people once you take into account the population they had working on these things. Now, by far the most difficult question when it came to building the pyramids was how did they get those rocks hoisted sometimes 400 feet or more up into the air to the top of the pyramid? Well, a few people have believed wrongly throughout history that mankind was much too ignorant to lift such a large weight up to such a height. Well, I believe this to be patently false, and I submit this one piece of evidence to the contrary. Back in 1920, there was a eccentric man by the name of Edward Leedskalnin, and Leedskalnin figured out that he wanted to build himself a very large castle made of granite. And, being rich and eccentric, he decided what he was going to do is he wanted to build it all by himself. And in addition to that, he decided he was not going to use any kind of power tools or engines or cranes. He was only going to use Bronze Age tools, specifically to try to answer the question, could a person have built the pyramids? Notice I didn't say could a work crew. Could a single person have built the pyramids? And so Leedsklain managed to move stone blocks over the course of several years, and some of them weighed over 30 tons. And he moved them into position using only the power of his own body, amplified by mechanical advantages from simple machines. So, if you can, try to picture this. A single stone of the pyramids usually weighed a few tons. Well, using the simple technology that Mr. Leedsklain used, for example, wooden levers, fulcrums, a block tackle and tripod, pulleys, using those kind of machines, the kind of machines you should have learned about in middle school science classes, a group of Egyptians could have moved any of the stones of the pyramid into place. And add to this that numerous cultures, like the ancient Celts, the Aboriginals of the South Pacific, all experimented with this kind of technology to produce monuments like Stonehenge or the Easter Island monoliths. And it becomes apparent that the Egyptians are not even working with unique technology, that they are not geniuses who just made this brilliant technology. Instead, they're more coming across as a doggedly determined people, that they want to accomplish something so great that no one else has tried. But they're doing it with technology that other people groups throughout the course of history managed to master quite well. And so it's here that we reach my second conclusion for this lecture, and that there's nothing really advanced about the pyramids. In terms of architecture, it's really just a massive stack of cubes and blocks. The most difficult aspect of the design of the Pyramid of Khufu is the king's burial chamber, and really that just needed a single large stone to support the weight above the open space. Not exactly what I'd call a brilliant design. Additionally, there's this adequate evidence that Bronze Age technology could have easily carved, transported, and arranged the stones of the pyramid in their proper place without having to have a supernatural reason for any of it. And so, let me tackle this question now that has made the rounds from time to time, usually proposed by various sci-fi fans or conspiracy theorists. And that's the question of, were the pyramids made by a hyper-intelligent alien or an angelic race, or even by a culture we just don't know about that was just far more superior than the Egyptians? And my simple answer to that is no. And it's for the following reasons. Firstly, as the past few slides have shown, the technology used to create the pyramids was not all that advanced. Its results are certainly impressive, but let's not confuse impressive with advanced. To suggest that a higher intelligence or an advanced science, mathematics, or even magic was employed to make the pyramids happen is to simply ignore the fact that the pyramids are nothing short of a large organized rock pile. They don't contain sophisticated technology. They don't connect to a more sophisticated technology like an engine or a battery or a spaceship. And personally, I think it's ludicrous to suggest that a hyper-intelligent race would travel all the way across the cosmos, or even simpler, even across the Egyptian desert, simply to teach primitive people how to stack rocks in a geometric shape. At this point, really, Occam's razor has to take over, and it becomes much more likely that a primitive people found a way to do basically a 4-year-old's pastime with a great deal of style. They stacked cubes, massive cubes, until they had a humongous building, and one that would hold a record for over 3,000 years for height. Now, my second reason for saying that this is not the work of an advanced race is this. The centuries of pyramid building that the Egyptians had to practice, showing a clear delineation between the simple forms of the pyramid and more advanced designs, suggests that this is a product of human trial and error over centuries. This is not a hyper-intelligent being just simply dropping advanced technology out of the sky saying, have fun, kids, or even building the pyramids themselves. We don't need a magic or science or even advanced technology contingency, because we've already done a pretty good job proving that Bronze Age technology could have gotten the job done as is. And lastly, we should just note that the Egyptians themselves have left their records, that the hieroglyphs throughout the centuries have claimed that Egyptians built the pyramids. And many of the inscriptions basically say they were made not by slave labor, but by people willing to work for the pharaoh, whom they believed to be a god who was responsible for the annual flooding of the Nile. And so, with these kind of incentives and motivations in mind, I think it is often wise to just simply let the Egyptians speak for themselves. That they don't claim that they're using magical or even meta-scientific means to build these pyramids. And, I find this odd because the Egyptian culture does frequently attribute supernatural causation to a lot of things they experience. But they don't do this with the pyramids. And the fact that they don't suggests that even to them, even though they thought the pyramids were fulfilling a spiritually significant function of their religion, it also says that they knew that building these things was also a very mundane building project. And everyone in antiquity, including the Egyptians in their own records, knew it and claimed it as such. And so at this point, we have to begin asking ourselves questions of historiography and epistemology. Now, historiography is the science of asking, how do we weigh and critique our sources of what we know about the past? And epistemology is more our theory of knowledge. How do we know that something is true? And by what means do we prove it? Now, as I've been pointing out, the overwhelming textual evidence of the ancient world, including evidence from the Egyptians themselves, is the claim that the ancient Egyptians, during the 3rd through 6th dynasties, were building the pyramids. And I find it interesting and oftentimes ironic that many far-fetched theories exist to the contrary. And so, as a matter of just historical inquiry, we should ask the question, why do such ideas come up? Why are people willing to contradict the Egyptians' own claims and the claims of just about every historical person all the way up until the modern era? Well, the reasons are twofold. And these reasons stem from two philosophical notions. The first is called anti-intellectualism, and the second is called postmodernism. Now, for anti-intellectualism, I like a quote by Isaac Asimov to describe what's going on here. Anti-intellectualism, he says, is the constant thread waving its way through our political and cultural life, and it's nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Now, historians of religion and culture have noted that in America, anti-intellectualism has been rising in popularity ever since the 1830s. And it's had many manifestations, but the biggest way that it manifests is just the simple understanding that a person is not likely to defer to an expert, regardless of how educated they are. And so if a person has got it in their mind that they are correct, well, it doesn't matter how much proof you give them. Their anti-intellectualism says, I already know what's true. And the second of these notions is postmodernism. And postmodernism as a philosophy is this basic understanding that we reject the idea of meta-narrative, that we, in many ways, reject that there is a concrete way of knowing at all. And so, with that degree of uncertainty, that we reject classic narratives and meta-narratives, and that we have this kind of deep and abiding idea that an expert more often than not is wrong, especially if what they say disagrees with what I already believe or hold true. You can see how it could be very easy that there can be a consensus on who built the pyramids, and yet a very small faction of people who would disagree, even vehemently, and it doesn't necessarily matter what the credentials are that they're being presented with otherwise. Just for an example, just looking through the popular and scholarly literature on pyramids, one of the things you'll find is an article produced in 1990 by Harvard University by a scholar who spent well over 30 years excavating at the pyramids. And one of the things that I noted about the comments section of that article, this is again, it's a scholarly article, but it had a popular forum, is that many people offered tons of possible explanations other than the explanation the scholar gave. They said, well, what about aliens? Well, what about Arabs? What about an unknown people group living thousands of years, maybe even millions of years before the Egyptians? And in all of these things, this is both an example of anti-intellectualism, that here's a person writing in a scholarly article, and these people are simply saying, I don't like that, so, yeah. And the postmodernism coming through as well that simply says, well, I just don't know if I trust any source of information to have authority, including, of course, a scholarly worldview. And this brings us to just our interesting problem of the day, and that is, as long as a human being denies the reliability of the testimony that is presented to them, it is impossible to prove anything happened historically. If I could just give you one example, here on our slide we have a picture of the old World Trade Center towers before the 9/11 attacks. Now, these buildings were made in the 1970s. That's at least what I'm told. I was not there to witness their construction. I do not have a physical picture of these buildings myself. I wish I would have taken a picture when I had the chance. But long story short, I cannot prove these buildings were built by human beings. They could have been built by aliens, and I've simply been told wrongly. And this is the problem of postmodernism, anti-intellectualism, and the basic issue of just rejecting the testimony that you see up front. If you reject the testimony of witnesses, then you are free to postulate whatever you want. And I find this to be a very dangerous historiography and a very dangerous form of epistemology, simply because, as a Christian, I am very well aware that there are many things in my own faith that I have to take as belief and not as fact. Now, I would also argue that many of these beliefs are grounded in historical realities, and I think that this is one of the major differences between my Christian faith and many of these things that I am disagreeing with here in this lecture, such as the fact that aliens may have built the pyramids, is simply that there is no proof that aliens built the pyramids, but there is quite a lot of proof to the contrary that the Egyptians did, that they believed that they did, that they wrote that they did, that they left us many pictures that they did, not to mention the fact that they left us many, many pyramids on their landscape, all of which show the possibilities of Bronze Age technology. And so, with all of this in mind, I'd like to just conclude by saying this. In our class, we keep using this idea of the historical critical method of historiography. And by that we simply mean that we are going to look at the historical context of that which we are studying, and we are then going to apply a certain amount of skepticism. We're going to say, is this a reliable source? Is this an accurate source? Do we understand where the source comes from? And if so, who are they writing to? Who are they trying to appeal to? What is the author? Who is their audience? And all of these questions come into play, and based on these things, we try to develop a theory of probability. How probable is it that this source is accurate and reliable? Now, as I've shown throughout this short lecture here, in this case of the pyramids, the odds are actually quite high that the Egyptians built the pyramids. It's also quite high that they built them using mundane means, because we've shown that most of the mundane Bronze Age technological means are both plausible and likely. And to the contrary, we can also show that modern suggestions that an advanced civilization, an angelic or even an extraterrestrial civilization may have helped or just produced the pyramids on their own, is both low in probability because it is A, lacking of evidence, and B, is basically expressing that they would have used Bronze Age technology to produce a more technological result, at least as per the claim. And in all of these things, I find that highly unlikely, whereas the Egyptians' own records that they built the pyramids, that they built them out of love and devotion for their pharaohs, and that they did so using basically gumption and a let's get it done attitude, was enough to build these massive structures. And so that's how I'll leave it here today, that the question of the pyramids is, of course, an interesting one. It's fun to think about it, it's fun to ponder it, and there are many unanswered questions. What kind of ramp methods did they use? What kind of work crews did they use? Was it slave labor? Was it conscripted labor? Was it free will labor? It's hard to say. But what is certain, at least with a high degree of certainty, is this: that the Egyptians were the ones who built the pyramids. They did so using the existing early Bronze Age technology, and that they were not, how should we put this, they were not incompetent in their work, that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they had many, many centuries to fine-tune and hone their craft until they were able to make the massive buildings that we see at Giza today.